From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Library of Congress and to our Books and Beyond presentation. My name is John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm. It was created way back in 1977 by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, who thought the Library of Congress should be doing more to promote books and reading. And this was before even the word literacy was well known or used. And of course, when literacy became a need in our society and something to be promoted, it was natural that the Center for the Book take that on. Today, we are the administrators of the Library of Congress Literacy Awards Project, and we're also involved with other things of a national level, in particular the National Book Festival. And I hope that many of you know about the National Book Festival. I brought this program from last year's festival to remind me to give it a plug, and also to say that with the author program of the National Book Festival, which has been the responsibility of the Center for the Book, along with a Pavilion of the States, which has people coming from all over the country to talk about books and reading. It was through the book festival that we've started getting more interested in graphic novels. And last year we really had last 2 years we've really had quite a program. We do have a network of state centers across the country in every state that help promote books, reading, literacy, and libraries. And we also work with nonprofit organizations. Here at the Library of Congress, we feature talks such as this one at our noontime Books and Beyond, which feature new books by authors who are connected one way or another with the Library of Congress, often working, as is this case with today's speaker, with our Prints and Photographs division quite closely. Our talks are all filmed for later viewing on the Library of Congress website. So I'm asking you to please turn off all things electronic. I want to remind you of a couple of handouts that are on the back table. We have a schedule of future talks in this series. We also have the latest issue of the Library of Congress magazine, imaginatively called LCM, which features the activities of the Center for the Book. And we also have a form we'd appreciate that you would fill out telling us how you first learned about this program to help us keep up the momentum of having from 12 to 20 of these talks each year. However, today to introduce, the plan would be for our speaker to give a presentation, to make a brief pause for any questions and answers, and then there will be a book signing at the conclusion right here in this room. So welcome again, and I would like to welcome Martha Kennedy, a curator from the Prints and Photographs division, to introduce our program. And I'm also going to try to find out from Martha what she is curator of, since I never seem to get it right. Would you like to include that in your self-introduction, Martha? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Martha Kennedy, and I'm a curator of popular and applied graphic art here at the library. And that means I have the great privilege of working with original cartoon and comic art and illustration art, among other materials. We are very thrilled in the Prints and Photographs division to be co-sponsoring this program with the Center for the Book today. And it's an honor for me to introduce our speaker, Peter Kuper, the author-artist of the graphic novel Ruins. Peter is an award-winning cartoonist and illustrator, an editor, art director, and arts educator. He is a very versatile and prolific artist. He creates not only cartoons and comics, graphic novels, but also illustrations and cover art for major magazines and newspapers. Currently, he is also a visiting professor at Harvard University. Peter was born in Summit, New Jersey, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, attended Kent State University, then came to New York City and studied at the Art Students League and the Pratt Institute. Oh dear, if I messed something up. He and his friend, fellow cartoonist Seth Tabachman, co-founded the political graphics magazine World War III Illustrated in 1979, and it is still going strong. Peter is well known for writing and drawing Mad magazine Spy vs. Spy, also for more than 18 years now. He's created more than a dozen graphic novels, including The System, Sticks and Stones, adaptations of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis and Give It Up, and a wonderful semi-autobiographical graphic novel called Stop Forgetting to Remember. Peter received a journalism award from the Society of Newspaper Designers in 2001, 2 gold medals and a silver medal from the Society of Illustrators in New York City. His work has been published and exhibited internationally, and the library is fortunate to hold examples of his strong and vivid drawings and prints in the Prints and Photographs division. He remains remarkably modest in light of his many accomplishments, about which more could be said. But for the moment, please help me welcome Peter Kuper. Thank you.
I followed that right up to the part where you said delightfully modest. And I thought, that doesn't sound familiar. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to the library for having me. It's really an honor to be here. And we first connected back in 2001 after 9/11, when there was an art show in New York that had a number of pieces that were about 9/11, and I was really grateful to make that connection and stay in touch throughout the years. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and I hope you'll follow along with me, and I won't bore you to death. So some of my history, or maybe all of our history, I grew up in the 60s and was sort of at the tail end of experiencing the Vietnam War and the hippie movement and all these things that I really felt like I missed out on. Not the war so much as the hippie movement. But there's this history that we all seem to have where that I get to capture in every issue of Mad Magazine with Spy vs. Spy, our tendency towards some form of destruction. And we've been capturing our history in art, and in fact, it's one of the few things that remains to indicate where we came from. There's no music left, unfortunately, from those days, those early days. And there has been a tendency, there's our early shopping habits, and that's actually Banksy. He put that up at the British Museum, and I stayed up for a couple of weeks before anybody realized it wasn't part of the exhibit. Gotta love Banksy. So one of the things that has seemed to happen also is that artists are drawn to talk about real life events, and somebody like Goya, who to his detriment did this series of etchings, Disasters of War, and paintings talking about what was going on. And he was, sort of the court painter, and he didn't have to be doing this, and it didn't help his career along. Same with Daumier, who his portrait of the king in France got him a 6-month jail time. So there has been this aspect of art that has always wanted to reach out and comment on the pillars of society, like Boss Tweed. This is Thomas Nast, and famously, this drawing of Boss Tweed helped the customs identify him when Boss Tweed fled the country, having pretty much ransacked the treasury of New York, and he ended up dying penniless in jail. Woohoo! Thomas Nast also developed the elephant and the donkey as our Democratic and Republican symbols. He also did the first image of Santa Claus, but some very wise people felt that a little more color would be nice, and so the Coca-Cola Company, figuring that it would be perfect to work with their logo, that's why we have a red and white Santa Claus. The English tried to change it to green and white more recently, and nobody was buying it. Coke is just too popular. So there were magazines also that were giving a forum to political artists like the Masses, and they too were shut down when Woodrow Wilson had promised us not to go into war and then did, and there was a whole movement against work like this. This is The Perfect Soldier by Robert Miner. And Simplicissimus in Germany, which gave a voice to artists like Kathy Kollwitz and John Hartfield. And these, it threatened their lives to do images like this in the 30s. George Gross, many of them, in fact, probably all of them had to flee in order to avoid concentration camps. Picasso got into the act too with Guernica, about the bombing of a Spanish town in Spain, and Diego Rivera's mural, Man at the Crossroads, which he curiously was hired by Rockefeller to do at Rockefeller Center. And I don't know if you know this story, but he put in this little image of Lenin under the wing, and Rockefeller said, you've got to take out, the biggest communist is in the lobby of the biggest capitalist. You've got to take that out. And Diego, who was getting a hard time from his friends for having taken on this commission, said no. And so Rockefeller paid him and chiseled it off the wall. There he is working on one mural or another. So, art is used in many directions. It's not always anti-war. The government can use it to direct people into war and or to support the war. And but then again, there's always some lefty popping up with their little commentary on even that. So in the 50s, there were war comics that were being produced. Harvey Kurtzman was one of the editors who did this, and he was really trying to do comics that were for adults, for soldiers, in fact, talking about war as it was. He was very concerned with being accurate with all the armaments so that no one could call him out and say that, it's a comic and it's just sort of glossing over things. This was also coming from a company, EC, that was doing pretty much a whole series of amazing comics. But this was in the 50s, around the time of McCarthyism, and there was a lot of scare about, just everything, including the fear that comics would lead to delinquency. And so there was a move by a guy named Frederick Wortham. He wrote an article that caused a big uproar, the seduction of the innocent. And people decided that comics were bad for children, that violent comics would lead to violence. We've heard this about Dungeons and Dragons too. This is an ongoing story. And that led the industry to say, okay, we'll self-censor. Please don't kill us, we'll self-censor. And in that self-censoring with the Comics Code, they also agreed to not have titles that included words like weird and crypt and, pretty much everything that EC published. And that knocked that line of comics that was heading towards a whole new possibility in the form of more adult comics. It knocked it out and it ushered in superheroes in a big way. The only one standing from the EC company was, oddly enough, Mad Magazine, the most subversive comic ever, which shows you what happens when you censor things. And Mad was a huge influence on me. I grew up reading it, and the idea that you could say these things about the pillars of society and make jokes and all, but I was a little put off when they made fun of hippies, because I thought, wait a minute, that where do they stand on these issues? I thought that they were left wing, and then they were every wing. Around the same time, Jules Feiffer, who's got, I believe his archives are with the collection, brilliant cartoonist who's done pretty much everything, was starting to do a comic strip in the Village Voice. And along with this, having been drafted in the Korean War, he came up with the story of a boy who's accidentally drafted, which is how he felt. A 4-year-old is drafted. And this was made into an animated film that won the Academy Award. Along comes Underground Comics, which is basically the children of Mad Magazine. Robert Crumb and a number of people were coming out with comics that really, really didn't have the comics code on them in any way, shape, or form. But one of the things I noted from these comics was also that they had a political sentiment. And first things I heard about environmental movement and a number of anti-war things in comics was coming out of Undergrounds. So this was a kind of poster that you'd see on a lot of college walls in the late 60s. And I love the idea that art could have this impact, that people would put this out and it was sort of like a rallying cry. And I grew up in the 70s, and it was, I was hoping to do art, and I wished that I could do something that had a happier face on it. But somehow or another, growing up through the Vietnam War, it was very difficult to ignore what was going on behind that smile. And when I was in art school, Ronald Reagan was just coming into office. If you don't happen to remember Ronald Reagan, it's okay. He may not have recalled either. But he promises a less bureaucratic shadow government. That's The Onion. We love The Onion. So with Ronald Reagan coming into office, the Cold War in full effect, the Iranian hostage crisis going on, it looked like we were headed towards war, and therefore the title World War III Illustrated seemed appropriate for the magazine that my friend Seth and I started. We started this because the underground comic scene had collapsed, and that we were doing politically minded comics, and we saw political art around in New York City where we were going to school, and we wanted to capture it because it felt like this wasn't showing up in mainstream media, and it was being washed away at the first rain when the posters fell down or the spray paint washed off the wall. And this is at the same exact time that Françoise Mouly and Art Spiegelman started Raw. In fact, we shared staplers on our first issue. And inside of Raw was this little booklet called Mouse, which certainly comic people like myself noted and loved in its chapter by chapter development. So World War III started talking about World War, like World War and the fear of World War III. And we realized pretty quickly, though, that what was going on in the streets of New York was something that we could talk about that was based on personal experience. And therefore, you could argue with the details of it, but it was based on something that we experienced firsthand as opposed to something that we might have read in the paper or in a book. And year after year, more and more people came to the magazine and seemed to be inclined to join us. And there were more editors involved, so it wasn't just two of us putting it together and trying to kill each other. And one of the secrets of our success, I've concluded over the years, is that our success was our failure, which is that we've never made any money. Everybody that works on the magazine does so for free. And but what it has provided is a payment of form, which is an opportunity to talk about urgent issues that we're desperate to get down on paper and to identify the history that may be an unspoken or unwritten history. And this has expanded out into other projects that we've done, art shows, murals. This was a big show that we had at Exit Art. I first connected with the Library of Congress when they saw a show that was at the same gallery on 9/11. And this is all part of, this was our 30th anniversary art show. And this is our 35th anniversary anthology. We've actually had 3 anthologies already along with the regular issues. And we are still publishing to this day. I'm working on the new issue, and I co-edited the last one. One of the other wonderful things that has happened is this has created an environment for artists to be able to do their work and get published. And that has led a number of the people involved to collectively do other graphic novels like Studs Terkel's Working, which we adapted. One of the people who had their work published here did 7 Miles a Second. And this is just a series of graphic novels that came out of the pages of World War III originally by cartoonists and editors who were involved in the magazine. And it's given us this, this proving ground, because it's so hard sometimes to get the sense of self and an idea that you can do comics, and especially with people in some cases who are doing their very first comics, like Sabrina Jones in World War III, and developed herself in the pages of the magazine with our associative editing and all. I always felt kind of ripped off growing up, like, oh, my generation arrives just, we get to the beach just in time for the waste to wash up, and we miss the beat generation, and we miss the hippie movement, summer of love, shebang. And but actually what we concluded is, these are things that they were developed by some group of people, and we too are a group of people, and so we sort of developed our own little movement of sorts. And that's my co-editor, one of his books and his more recent book. Eric Drucker, who also I believe is in the library. Flood, I believe, is here. And Blood Song. These are incredible graphic novels. I recommend all of them to you. I know a lot is going by. So before I get into my own work, I'll just give you a quick rundown on the secrets of the graphic novelist. This is the Boys Club version because I'm a boy. So it's very important when you're growing up to have some dedicated time to read comics and look at them. And this seems to be a consistency between cartoonists, is the missing the sports gene. That's the fifth quarter they're playing, by the way. Of course, life experiences to draw upon in your work are very important. You must believe in yourself. That would be young Chris Ware, probably. Or fill in the blank of famous cartoonist. Some spiritual connection, I think, is important. And ultimately, being excited about a career in the arts. So one of my earliest graphic novels was an adaptation of The Jungle. And I did this in stencils and spray paint, which was a very odd form for comics. And I also tried to apply some of the art influences I had, Little Russian constructivism and German expressionism, to do some of the imagery, which I thought why that could fit very much into comics. Another big influence on me has been travel. Getting to see many parts of the world has given me a connection with a lot of the subject matter that I want to talk about. I was in New Guinea, and it's helped me develop a lot of ways of drawing that I wouldn't have otherwise maybe gone down if I had just worked consistently, where you're being told you have to have a style and you have to have a certain look and a certain way of doing things, and I just did whatever I wanted in my sketchbook, and that has served me very well in many different ways, and has led down a lot of different paths. Although even when I'm sitting on a beach in some beautiful place in Mexico or Thailand or Indonesia, I seem to always return to my concerns about world events. This is a book I did crazily for DC Vertigo, which is the same people who do Batman and Superman. And an editor came there and asked me if I had any ideas, and I had this idea about sort of the connective tissue between all of us. And I thought I would do it as a wordless book because, among other things, even stylistically, I wanted to confound people who felt the comics, they understood what comics were and had dismissed them. So comics have word balloons, and comics have this certain kind of muscly style. And so I took those things away, and the subject matter I tried to make more adult. And really, when comics are a very interactive medium. In fact, I think there's a high level of visual literacy that is asked of the reader, and that's part of why they're often dismissed. People will say, if they look at fine art and they don't understand it, they think they're stupid. But if they look at comics and don't understand it, they think the artist is stupid. And it seems to be, to quote Chris Ware, I believe. Anyway, this is a little bit of my approach. So actually, I cut stencils from my pencils, and there's holes in paper which are then sprayed with red paint and black paint from cans, not airbrush, and then watercolor and a little colored pencil. Here's another one. And I got to utilize the information I got from traveling to these distant places where I went to rainforests where it wasn't raining necessarily. The people at MAD saw what I was doing with wordless comics and asked me if I wanted to try out for Spy vs. Spy, and my reaction was almost an immediate no, because I'm an idiot. And they recognized the idiocy in me and thought he'd be a perfect member of the gang. And so I did a sample, and I realized when I did this how much the creator of Spy vs. Spy, Antonio Prohias, a Cuban artist, had influenced me. And I remember looking at those spies and trying to decipher the puzzle, and it was just, and it ended up being part of my DNA a little bit. So when I did my tryout, I thought I would do something that would confound them. I wasn't going to try and look like Prohias, so I did it in stencils and spray paint, and turned out that's what they were looking for, and I'm now in my nearly coming into 2 decades of doing it. I really enjoy exploring all the things you can do with comics, and one of them is adaptations and autobiography and journalism. And a friend of mine used to read Kafka stories while over beers, and we would have a good laugh over the dark humor in his work. And I did one collection, and then later I thought, the Metamorphosis, that's the cover of the original Metamorphosis from 1915. And I thought I would give that a go. But before I did that, I actually had the opportunity to do a Treehouse of Horror for The Simpsons. And I thought, what if? Though, but it was all a dream. Or was it? Though, with echo. And of course, Lisa's suggesting that he read Charlotte's Web. So before I started the Metamorphosis, I decided to look back at what comics were being produced at that time. And there's a brilliant cartoonist, Winsor McKay, did Little Nemo in Slumberland, actually predating what Kafka did, especially his strip Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, which had this remarkable surreal quality to it. And though he always allowed people to wake up at the end. This is from 1913. It says Silas on there. That was his pen name because he was so prolific. He was working for multiple papers, and so he took a pen name. But the period quality mixed with the tone of the work, it was perhaps this is what was the zeitgeist of the world. But I always wondered if Kafka had seen these comics. So that's my cover of Metamorphosis. Now, Kafka did say, whatever you do, don't put the bug on the cover, but he also told the executor of his estate, Max Brod, to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts. And I figured if his friend could ignore him, I might do a little of the same. So I decided to do it in something called Scratchboard, which would approximate something like woodcut, though it allowed me to have the much more complicated work that I needed to do with pen and ink. And I wanted to get the feeling of that time period. And I generally try to serve the story, whatever that may be, with the style and not worry about, I'm going to do the style that I do and then it's going to fit around me, but rather it's nice that my style happens to fit with Kafka, and that's probably why I was drawn to it. So the events from back then are still happening, and I've been given the opportunity to illustrate them in many publications, and I seem to be the go-to guy for stress and concern. It's something I don't know, there's a lot of oomph I can get behind this kind of imagery that I never was able to do when I was doing something that was lighter. So when George Bush came into office around that time, and that pretty quickly led to a point in time with September 11th. This is an image that actually the library has in their collection. And it was really a time when I understood the importance of alternative media, because it was next to impossible to do any imagery that was counter to the general voice of government, which was we need to go and kill more people elsewhere in order to address being the attack. And I understood the sentiment, but the sort of aimless sense of where we had to go And this is also a time when people like Art Spiegelman, who did Maus, won a Pulitzer Prize, had trouble getting his work in mainstream media, couldn't get his work published in The New Yorker, where he had been an editor, in fact, because there was really a distinct shutdown on what was being said. This is the cover of the issue of World War III that we did before we went into Iraq, where it was extremely clear to a large number of us, in fact, millions, that the war in Iraq was a terrible idea that we were going to deeply regret. And yes, it was very much like Vietnam, contrary to what was being suggested in the media. And thanks to people like Janet Malcolm, who helped us believe that there were weapons of mass destruction, that the next smoking gun would be in the form of a nuclear weapon headed our way. And so we sent a whole lot of people into harm's way, and we've pretty much outstripped the number of people that were killed, Americans that is, that were killed in 9/11, let alone the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed in various other countries. This is one of my responses. Oddly enough, one of my first jobs was as an inker on Richie Rich, and I knew it would come in handy one day. Ooh, sorry. Cha-ching. So these were the kind of images that we were doing. Yes, they were. We felt the strain of our Constitution under attack. This is actually something I did for Time magazine. There was a moment in time there where mainstream publications were actually running articles that were discussing these things. The message that was seeming to come from government was, get duct tape. And I don't know if you remember the symbol for the Total Information Awareness Office. It was run by John Poindexter, and the name seemed vaguely familiar. I remembered it was from the Iran-Contra hearings where he was caught up in that scandal, and he was making a return, but this symbol scared people too much, and they took it away pretty quickly. Although perhaps what was put in motion is still with us today. You may also recall libraries were under surveillance, and librarians were told they had a gag rule that they could not speak about individuals who were taking out books were being under surveillance, and if you took out a book that had the word bombed in it, like I got bombed last weekend, say, and but I had a mild hangover and I'm okay, that was being tracked. So it seemed to be was a lot of our privacy. Though curiously, a recent study said that about 90% of the fake bombs and other weaponry that they tried to put through to test whether our TSA was functioning got through. So apparently their eye is not, sorry for all this, I forgot about all my sound effects. I'll lower them a little if I can. But maybe we should all jump in our seats when we think about gun control in this country and what exactly leads it. And the lack of health care, there's been a lot of attempts to get health care, but there seems to be a lot of roadblocks on that basic idea, and education and other things. We want less government, apparently, but we want more debt. And perpetually hoping there's a plan. I know I am. I know there's a lot of people that are really hoping that there's a plan for these various incursions. Makes you kind of wish for the good old days when, instead of things being blown up, they were just, I won't even go there. So there was that moment in time that lasted quite a while. This is the image that I put forward to the New York Times for an article on Abu Ghraib about 4 days after the event. They said, that is such an overused symbol. And it's like, it's just become a symbol. How can it be overused? This is what I did get through, which isn't like a total, missed the boat completely, but it was talking about these connections that I wanted to put in the work. So censorship doesn't necessarily come in the form of absolutely you can't do it. It's more like, that's not really working, or they kill the article that I did for Time magazine. I illustrated a piece by Garrison Keillor before we went into Iraq where he was saying this is a terrible idea, and they just killed the article in my art. Einstein was quoted as saying that he doesn't know how we'll fight World War III, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And this inspired the title of this book, the notion that I got kind of tired of drawing political figures that I knew were going to turn to dust and people wouldn't even necessarily remember who they were. And so I decided to do something that was more of an allegory, Because I did wonder, where do we get leaders like this? Where do they come from? And I thought maybe they just get spit out of a volcano somewhere and they self-actualize, and for some crazy reason we give them power, which they are more than happy to take, very often to our detriment. So in these next elections, thank you, Diebold, it was a point in time where I had been foaming at the mouth for a good while, and I decided, my wife and I had talked about taking a sabbatical year. We wanted our daughter to get a second language, and I had lived in Israel when I was 10. My father had a sabbatical, and it was a huge, both traumatic and incredibly expanding experience, being thrown into a school where I didn't speak the language, and I thought, we should do this for our daughter. And we very randomly picked this small town in Mexico, Oaxaca. Yeah, I barely knew how to say the name. Oaxaca, Oaxaca, really? So there's my daughter at 9, got her there, aw. She's now in college, gulp, that happened fast. I thought it would be a great chance to see other art, really kind of get out of my head with all the political work I've been doing. This is a radish festival they have every year. They carve radishes into creches and things like that. And I did get the opportunity to spend a lot of time drawing in my sketchbook and beautiful scenery, and it became very mural-like. It was funny. I think I understood where somebody like Diego Rivera came from. Not so much I was looking at his art as I was looking at Mexico, and it seemed to be this synergy and synthesis and simultaneity there between the past and the present. There goes my clicker again. So we arrived in 2006, and I noticed there was a lot of graffiti as we made our way towards the airport, and we barely spoke Spanish. And I asked the taxi driver who that was, and it was, it's the governor, and apparently he had stolen the election. And well, I could read that actually. Truth be told, we never were offered anything but kindness in our 2 years down there. But it just happened that there was a teacher strike going on, and this was an annual event that had been going on for 25 years, but the new governor had decided, instead of giving them their normal pay raise, which was pretty meager, that he would try to just expel them from the Zocalo, the town square. He sent in police in the middle of the night, and instead of expelling them, it made the strike much larger. Other different unions joined in, and people poured into Oaxaca, and that eventually people were getting shot, and federal troops arrived when a single American journalist was killed. And written on their shields is murderers. 2 women I saw, they wrote that on the shields, and I kept waiting for the guys to rearrange the shields so it said, "Have a nice day," or something like that, but never happened. And amazingly, they let them do this without attacking them. So we ran away from, at least somebody was happy, you know. I asked, she was okay. But one of the things I noticed when we were down there was how much art played a role in daily life. And this is during Day of the Dead. And people would open up the cemeteries, and these places that I always considered to be a black and white, sad experience that everybody was crying, it was always raining, was this happy, music-infested place. And people did commentary about the events. And it just seemed like everybody was an artist. And there was just art everywhere, and it really felt like it was part of society and not something that you saw only in a museum. And you could feel the spirit of the past artists like Posada, who died penniless, did all this political art, but he did it in woodblock form, and it got reproduced again and again, and he's among the most famous artists of Mexico now. And here you see the reflection of that kind of work. Or Diego Rivera's murals, which were being replicated in ways like this. That was in the Zocalo, where they were doing these hand-done murals that were describing what was going on during their time. But it might be more appropriate to say that one of the bigger influences on the strike was Frida Kahlo, because women were the main force behind the teachers' strike. and many of the plans and the actions were implemented by women. And I found myself starting to draw these things. And I realized I wasn't trying to escape from drawing political things. I just wanted a different political subject matter to draw. And that had a little more maybe light in it. I'm not sure. My version of light, at least. I love the backdrops. I would be sitting at a cafe and that would be my view. There was a strike, there was a march that happened one day, and my wife and I went down there. We were having a date, and my version of the date was we'd go down there and I'll draw. And she was like, okay, honey. And so we left, and 5 minutes after we departed, the troops attacked, and we missed being rounded up by a very small margin. And I finished the drawing. I did the bottom part of the drawing down there, and then I finished the drawing with what I saw on the internet when we got home. And I was able to put this into World War III. Again, I had got 11 pages to talk about what was going on, and nobody was interested in doing that big of a story in mainstream publications. I did end up in Mexican newspapers as a result of the work I was doing. And again, it was so important to have outlets like this alternative media. And this turned into a book that I did when I got back from Mexico that included all of my sketch work. So we arrived back in New York after 2 years, just in time for the crash and for my career to take a downward turn as magazines folded and my illustration career went thud. And Obama was just coming into office with a whole new set of things being handed to him. And unfortunately, yes, we can't. Which made me, over the years, want to return to Mexico and have a little of some form of escape yet. And it came in the form of this graphic novel idea that percolated for many, many years. And I wanted to capture the experience that we had down there, but I decided to do it in a fictional account where I was able to talk about the circumstances and place my characters right in the middle of things rather than where we were at somewhat of the periphery. And this way I wasn't tied to so many of the specifics, and I could do things that I wanted. And these characters visited the various ruins and have their experiences. And I could talk about the inner lives of various Mexicans that we encountered and the events that took place on those days, only with the characters being dead in the middle of them. Another aspect of it is that while we were down there, I'm a closet entomologist. Before I got interested in comics, I was a bug fan. And while we were down there, it was like a return to my childhood because there was so many insects in Mexico that my sense that that's all disappearing, that environmentally it's changing, it seemed on hold in Mexico. And one of the ways that we connected with that was with the monarch butterfly, where we raised monarchs down there, my daughter and I, and then we visited Michoacan, where they come down by the millions. At one point, it was about in the last 10 years, 1 billion monarchs made their way to this forest and passed through our world to get there. Science does not actually know how they know to get down there. They've done all sorts of different studies. They figure that they're sort of GPSing off the sun and the electromagnetic pulse of the earth. People have tagged monarchs. It was only in 1975 that they first discovered where they even went. And they found these tags these little stickers they put on them down in this one area. That, of course, the people down there knew they were there, but it was sort of a quiet thing. But in one sanctuary, and there's 5 of them, 11 million monarchs show up. And it's a long road to get there. So in the last 10 years, the billion has actually whittled down to 30 million. And as is my wont, I had them pass over, my particular monarch pass over many a thing that had double meaning. New Orleans, the 9th Ward. Easier for monarchs to cross borders. And sometimes towns that were violent, and sometimes towns that were just plain beautiful. And the natural ways that monarchs are also threatened. But fortunately for monarchs, they are attracted to milkweed, and milkweed has a poison in it that they survive, but birds have learned to avoid. There's even evolutionarily a butterfly called the viceroy that mimics the look of monarchs, even though it's very tasty, and it survived as a result. So trying to imagine what's going on in the mind of the monarch in order to make its way to 2,000 or 3,000 miles, and it weighs a gram, travels 12 miles a day, perhaps. It's just you have to be in awe of life and our world. And it even will go so far as to go all the way down to Mexico and then continue on back and get as far as Texas in one generation. Also, weirdly, it manages to initially, the first generation lives for a couple of weeks, the second generation maybe 7 weeks, and then the third lives for 6 months. And how that even happens, still like, wow, entomologists discuss. So seeing this world of ours has made me consider our position in it, and the big questions of whether hegemony is more important than what may happen to us as a result of that, and whether our water supply is secondary to our gas supply, and whether our forests are necessary even, and whether what happens in the Arctic will happen on Wall Street, and whether we can formulate new ideas to address these very, very urgent issues. So here's my little weather report. But for those of you that are in New York, never fear. Alternate side parking will remain in effect. So this idea that what happens in one place happens in another makes me want to roll back the clock and return it to things that once were. And yes, me worry. I do scream, and not just for the Beatles. And as we come up on this next election and they're passing the torch, all these issues about who's red and who's green, and who's red and who's blue, the things that separate us and the things that we talk about that are our divisions are so much less important than what connects us. Because we're really all on the same path, and where we started and where we're going is exactly the same. There may be some people who don't believe that, but it is so. And though we can affect change that can cause catastrophic things or repair, we share this world with all these other creatures, and they don't have that advantage. They just have to live here. They don't get to make the changes. And the clock is ticking on that in a very big way. But ultimately, the thought I would like to leave you with is, as we struggle together in this very important job of survival, be kind. Thank you. Yeah, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if not, I'd be happy to sign books. Anybody? Yes?
What's about your Harvard course?
It's the first comics course that they've ever had. It's with the Visual Environmental Studies program. And I don't know, I just got pulled out of a hat, much to my happy surprise. I've taught at the School of Visual Arts in New York for 25 plus years. So I guess somebody heard that. But the students caused this to happen because there was pressure developing to have classes so that some people wanted to do their dissertations in comics. And there was just this percolating interest in the form. And I always feel, incredibly lucky that I seem like I'm at the door a lot for book festivals and situations like that, where the first interest in comics, it finally breaks through and I get to go talk at a book festival, or in this case, teach students graphic novels. And I have them do a single page comic every week. One of my students said it was the hardest class that he had in all his time at Harvard. And I was like, sorry, it's the same class I teach at the School of Visual Arts, But it is so brilliant. The students are so great to teach that the 5-hour commute each way once a week from New York is totally worth it to me. I'm giddy about going up there, and my class is 4 hours long, and I run out of time. It's I can't explain it completely. I used to have a much shorter class, and I'd run out of things in the first half hour, but the students just provide a lot. I have 12 students in the class, and I actually have to select them, which is another tremendous boon. So up to 40 students will apply for the class, and then I interview all of them, and then pick 12. And 12 is the right number for 4 hours. And I have them do assignments that are things like based on a dream that they had, interview somebody. So there's comics journalism, autobiography, and social content, and I keep shifting it. There was a long time where in my class I had them say, "Where were you 9/11?" And I watched progressively as I was, let's see, my mommy brought me some cookies and I don't remember it. And I'm like, okay, time to drop that one. What's next? So it's an evolving thing, and in that way, which is exciting for me too. Yes.
I'm curious about, are they a mix of students in art and English, and what kind of...
It's.
Repeat that.
Oh yeah, the question was, is the class a mixture of students from art and other disciplines? And yes, it's this year it's the smallest number from art, and I have computer scientists, economists, medieval studies students, English majors. I remember in my very first class, I'm in my third year there, and my first class, the very first assignment somebody brought in with a title in Latin, and I just thought, I'm so screwed. And one of the students said, I don't speak Latin, what the hell does that say? And I was like, saved. So yeah, I went from feeling quite daunted by, the other thing I was told was that by the person who hired me, oh, by the way, they're not a race of super intelligent aliens, and I was like, oh, right, they're humans, yeah, okay, got it. And it turns out, yes, they are hard workers. That's the notable thing. They don't tend to miss class, and they tend to do all the assignments, which doesn't happen as often in my other classes. But generally speaking, it's really the future of comics, to me, are people who are coming from other disciplines. It's one of the things that's happened with World War III is that we've gotten a lot more women in comics. My class of 12 has 2 guys. And it is so great because the women will lead the charge into what's happening in the form, and people from various backgrounds, not just a bunch of nerdy white guys. I've been going to comic conventions my whole life since I was 11. It used to be literally all guys and pretty much all white guys, and that going to comic conventions now, the dynamic has changed dramatically, and as a result, the material that's being made has changed dramatically. And if you're not a comic reader, if you just with a little searching, you can find something that will touch on something that interests you, that from all areas. There's civil rights movement done in comics, a lot of gay, lesbian subject matter. In fact, that seems to be a huge arc I'm noticing from the last alternative convention I went to. More gay superheroes and things like that. But really pretty much everything. There's tremendous journalism being done in comics. Joe Sacco is an artist he's tackled the Palestinian situation, and Sarajevo and India, and you name it. And then you have these pillars like Maus that tackled the Holocaust, which was obviously a huge breakthrough. But there's subsequently been a lot of other work by people with a wide range of backgrounds. And so if you read at all, you can find something that will touch on something that you will be probably very interested in. Fun Home is a fairly recent autobiography that was made into a play I saw recently. It was brilliant, won the Tony Award, Best Play, with good reason. Yes?
Do you like to use any digital tools in your illustration?
You're looking at a very digital piece right there, and the coloring on the monarch butterfly section was digital. I keep a huge component of paper art in my work, in the same way I'm very big on print. I love print, and I don't want to miss that, but I would miss it if, I'm hoping it's kind of like vinyl, it's coming back. But yeah, I'm interested in all those different tools. I try to discourage it to some extent in class, because I want them to at least start with hand-drawn things, and then they can find out how it can be augmented digitally, because I see a lot of not very good drawing that's being masked by that, and I think there's a lot of steps in between. Am I out of time?
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
All right.
Did that answer it?
And I scared that question away. Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right.
Peter, this has been wonderful. We've been treated, you realize, to a history of comic art. We've learned the secrets of a graphic novelist. We slowly crept up on Peter's own work and career and saw how it would fit, but also kind of where it's going. And it's really been a wonderful presentation for all of us, and we'd like to join hands and thank you one more time. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.